All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us on the third and final day of the Prague European Summit. I'm Emily. I'm a journalist from Washington, D.C., but I'm very pleased to be with you in Prague today to moderate this high-level ministerial panel on the role that Central Europe will play in the European Union after these elections. I'm joined today by four gentlemen who need no introduction, but to earn my keep, I will introduce them anyway. We have Florian Herrmann, head of the State Chancellery and Minister of Federal and European Affairs and Media in Bavaria. Minister Tomáš Petříček of the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Oliver Schenk, head of the State Chancellery and Minister for Federal and European Affairs in Saxony. And finally, we have František Růžička, State Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs of the Slovak Republic. To get us started today, if you were here for the first panel on Monday, you'll have heard the moderator say that there's no such thing as Central Europe. And I thought that's so interesting because in 2 days, I'm moderating a panel on Central Europe. So we thought that it might make sense for the panelists to give opening remarks on how they define Central Europe and to make it a bit less like a graduate school seminar, why it's important to consider the role that it will play in Europe following these European parliamentary elections in the European Union. Minister, since we're in your house, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would start by a famous saying, when one door closes, another opens. And if you apply this to the time when the Cold War finally came to its conclusion, the proverbial door being closed was the communist bloc in Europe. The one being opened was, on the other hand, the rebirth of Central Europe, an entity kept alive thanks to the intellectual construction of few thinkers and writers in this particular region within Europe. I might name Václav Havel, but also famous Czech author Kundera, who asked whether this Central Europe has already been kidnapped by Soviet Russia or not yet. The opening of the door towards the rebirth of Central Europe was less apparent than the closing of the door to the communist past. In the 90s, the prevailing spirit in the new democracies was, in my opinion, captured by the English pop group, the Pet Shop Boys, in their hit Go West. We all wanted to go west since that was the desired guarantee for our security in terms of aspiration for NATO membership and prosperity in terms of aspiration for European Union membership. However, the Central Europe's role, if there is any, could be defined, in my understanding, as the transitory station on the way westwards. Yet, the time, as we know, are changing. The world is changing. The political commitment to Western civilization perseveres unchanged. However, in the course of the last 10 to 20 years, it has proven that the life of a society doesn't solely consist of politics. It also has a mental dimension. And I dare to say that mentally countries like Czechia, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, Slovenia, and to a significant extent also Germany, differ from countries traditionally labeled as Western Europe. Retrospectively, no wonder that during the 90s, West European countries were predominantly rather skeptical compared to the new democracies. On Monday, we discussed about this one-word definitions of key dates, be it 1989, 2004, 2019, and the 90s were dominantly optimistic, enthusiastic about change in our region. So in the past decade, however, I think the baton of skepticism moved from the west eastwards towards countries which, with their consent or without, encapsulate a new version of the old Central Europe. The agreement or the existence or emergence of the Central Europe may be an important step towards a proper reflection of what is currently going on in Europe. It always helps to call a spade, but by far it is not enough to approach this world in a proactive way or steer future development into a compliance with one's own interest only. It's necessary to equip, in my opinion, Central Europe with a toolbox of strategies and alliances which allow for doing so. For Czechia and Czech diplomacy, representatives of some nature Central European partners are sitting with me on the panel, but there are also others. Germany, and namely Bavaria and Saxony, and Slovakia are not just very close neighbors, but also our strategic allies in our quest to make Central Europe strong, innovative, prosperous, and most of all, constructive proponent of the European integration process with regard to its attractiveness and also sustainability. Of course, these partners are not just Germany or Slovakia. We have very close ties to Austria, Poland, Hungary, Slovenia, but also I would like to take probably the opportunity to include Switzerland or Liechtenstein, because I think these countries belong to among our Central European partners and logically create with us Central European initiatives, like before, like Slavkov, but also Czech-German strategic dialogue is part of this Central European dynamics. And in these dynamics, our common approaches are conceived, are cultivated, and are projected to European level. And if I may briefly close by replying to a question about what is our primary strategy. In a nutshell, Czech diplomacy would like to empower all Central European formats to work out tangibly and effective recommendations to solve the current economic, social, security and climate challenges on both a regional level, but also at a European level, and start together with Brussels, with broader European Union and other EU partners, a common search for the best possible and viable EU strategy. Among our priorities are, with respect to deepening of the single market, preservation of its four freedoms, freedom of movement of people, services, goods and capital, but also working on innovations and ecosystems allowing for effective and irreversible climate protection, but also support to EU integration of the Western Balkan, pro-European paths of our Eastern partners, but also encouragement to what we have been already doing, and it is especially people-to-people contact and civil society's contacts in Central Europe. And what we can only hope that this way, based on pragmatism and transparent competitiveness, will make Central European countries regain their former optimism. I hope that we will start with 2019 a new trend, that the enthusiasm will return after 30 years back to our region. Thank you.
Thank you. State Secretary?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to this conference, and I'm very glad and privileged to be here. I like about the conference is the fact that, of course, you prepare for some scenario and then the totally different is going on to happen. But let me just briefly reflect the question that was asked, what is the Central Europe? Firstly, what I would like to say, I feel myself like the European. Slovakia is 15 years members of the European Union. Slovakia is on the way of the transitions and the changes, the deep changes, in the industries, economies, political, mentally, etc., for over 30 years. So from this point of view, I'm not a very keen fan of any divisions based on the way of the west or central or east, from this point of view. Having said that, of course, we have to see the context, how we define the Central Europe. I mean, we can see the historical context. Partially, it was mentioned by Minister Petriček that, of course, after 45, the Iron Curtain was put down and Europe was divided to the west and east, and for several decades it was certain kind of the synonym for the ideological divisions. And of course, historically, it left some footprint in our minds as well, in our minds meaning the Central and Eastern Europeans. So from this point of view, of course, you are right to solve it. But you can look the different historical point of view. Like, are we looking at the Central Europeans, those who were in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy or in the wider Central Europe? Also, I mean, taking into account the part of Germany, part of Liechtenstein, etc. Which, of course, there is a certain kind of the historical thing. But again, the relativity is, and let me use an example. When I was in Poland, I met the representative from India, and he was the representative of one of the global companies. I'm not going to name it, because I don't think it is allowed. And I asked him over the lunch that what countries he represents, this company, and he said, the Central Europe. And I said, oh, of course, that's Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary. And I said, no. I represent my company in Baltic states, Visegrad 4, all Western Balkans, Romania, Bulgaria, and Ukraine. So from his point of view, from Indian point of view, this was the Central Europe. So the thing is, let's not make the artificial divisions. When we talk geographically, when we talk historically, fine. But when we talk about the EU cooperation, we should not use these divisions after 15 years because, again, having said at the beginning that I feel myself as, of course, citizen of Slovakia, but European, Slovakia went because we wanted to be the strong part of the European Union through 3 extremely difficult periods of reconstructions. It was the accession and accepting the acquis. Having done then over the 10 years, I mean, it was quite a heroic result, what we achieved without any huge social unrest. Then there was a crisis in the banking sector, but not the one in 2009, but before what we had. And we have been not asking anyone to help us with any kind of the firewalls or whatever, but we did it ourselves, having borrowed around, I don't know, at that time it was 8 billion euro. The third reforms, very, very difficult, were when we were joining Euro. I mean, going through all the processes and scrutiny, that was something that really showed that in every aspect we feel ourselves like the 100% Europeans, without having and without really being happy and glad to see. And I saw one of the questions on the slide, though I know that I should not refer to it, but we feel like the Europeans. We don't want to sit around the table, and it doesn't help the European Union cooperation in these times. We don't want to sit around the table having said, okay, you are the benefactor, you only benefit and we only paying. It is not true. And we can discuss about it, I mean, with very concrete arguments. But what European Union needs these days is that we overcome these kind of artificial divisions, North, South, West, East, Central Europe, whatever. And we sit around and think, I mean, strategically about the project, where we would like to go as equal members of the 28 or 27 member states of the European Union. So the Central European definition for me has historical context, has geographical context, but does not have the political within the EU context, because it's the countries that could be geographically in the Central Europe, they don't have the same political dynamics. So we are not the countries that have the same developments within our countries. But of course, what we have, there is a certain higher level of joint interest because of our joint common history of 5 decades when we were in the totalitarian countries. But otherwise, I think, speaking on Slovakia, I feel like European and I feel like equal member of the European Union.
Okay, thank you. I will turn now to the Germans.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me and having me here. It's a great pleasure, especially great pleasure to meet with my friend Tomasz again. Thank you very much. I'm, for myself, raising the question, why are we raising the issue? What is Central Europe? And I think it's not because we all are experts in geography. It's not necessary, just take a map and you see where is the center. And I agree very much with the State Secretary who said, well, it's a question of perspective. If you are from India, the center is something different. For us in Europe, by the way, if you think of our school books, of our maps in school, you always have Europe in the center. If you are Chinese, you have Europe maybe left on the top as a small part. So that's always a question of perspective. But the interesting question is, why do we raise it? And I think the first issue would be that we have to realize in all parts of Europe, especially in the parts of Europe which are longer than 15 years member, that it's not a question of size. It's not a question of size whether you are relevant or not relevant in this European Union. That's something I would say the two of us learned of our big party leaders like Helmut Kohl or Franz Josef Strauß or Edmund Stoiber, who always taught us that it's so important to have very good relationships also to the smaller countries, to the Eastern Europe countries, and for me it's not a question of size. In general, I think we have to stay together as European member states to put Europe as an entity into the position to deal with all the changes that we have to deal with at the moment. The big struggles between US and Russia, US and China, all the changes, and that's why it's so important that we don't start dividing Europe or splitting up into different groups. And so for me it's really important to raise the question, why do we have to define Central Europe or things like that? So I think especially as Western European and older European states, it's important to show respect to all countries of Europe, and respect also means to accept that there are different points of views. That it would be the wrong approach, which unfortunately sometimes we can see in, for example, in Germany, to have this kind of moralistic unilateralism, walking through all Europe and explaining to everyone only if our way of thinking is established in any place in all Europe, then it's fine. That would be completely the wrong way, and that would lead to separatism or to dividing movements, which is not good. And so I think we all have to work on the mental definition of Europe in total, and not in parts of Europe. And so that is not only the responsibility of Central Europe or Eastern Europe states, but of all states, because if someone starts dividing or starts organizing himself, you always have to ask yourself, why are they doing it? And maybe you yourself are doing something wrong so that it leads to this development. So I think that is the most important point, that we stay together and that we think Europe as one idea and not as separated movements.
Okay, thank you. And finally.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and the warm welcome here. And Thomas, I think it was a good idea of you and your colleagues.
Sorry, hang on. Can we get his microphone fixed? No, don't blame yourself. I don't think they can hear you. But this gentleman is running up at breakneck speed to fix the problem.
Can you?
Yeah,
now
that's better.
it's-
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks again. Thank you for the invitation and this warm welcome this morning. It's always good to be here in Prague, and I think it was a good idea, Thomas, of you and your team to organize the summit so shortly after the elections. And when I started this morning in Dresden and took the motorway to Prague, I remembered it's always a shorter way to Prague than going to Berlin. And I like the cooperation we have in our region. Yesterday we celebrated 20 years of good partnership with our neighbor community in Poland, in Wrocław. Today I'm here, and this shows that we work good together in our region. I agree with a lot of things just said before, and I would like to add some more arguments, maybe also from a general perspective, before we then later go in the discussion maybe to the question of Central Europe. And I think we certainly agree in this room that we had better times when it was, or easier times to discuss and work on the European project. And I think we saw last Sunday the return for anti-European parties, deeply skeptical of Europe. We saw it in East Germany with interesting results between East and West Germany, in the UK, in Hungary, or in Italy. And you may allow me to put it this way: Europe, as we know it, faces the very question of what it is doomed to be. And I have to think, Florian already mentioned some names more frequently these days about what Helmut Kohl or Václav Havel, this great inspiring European, would have said or done in these days, about how both gave the promise of a united Europe. A promise that after decades of separation and two devastating wars between the homelands of so many people on this continent was hard by the people. And it is when I ask myself, do we, as politicians, who bear responsibility today, do enough to confront this growing disenchantment with Europe that we see at every corner in the EU? Is not the European idea bigger than just the summing up of national interests? I say yes, it is, of course, and we better fight for this idea about peace, about freedom, about the well-being of each woman, man and children. And it is a task that can be fulfilled, but together. And taking this into account, I'm delighted, dear colleagues, that we meet today to tackle the questions of how Central Europe can take a more active role in the concert of the world's leading powers as a strong and globally action region. And I think we all know how important it is to answer these questions. Or is there someone in this room or in our countries who really thinks that we, in a globalized world with more than 7 billion people, one of our regions, one of our countries has the chance to set the rules alone? I think the only chance we have is to do it together. Then we can set the rules and have the chance to influence developments. Working together, hand in hand, full of respect of each other, and promoting the principles of a market economy, of freedom of press, and the principles of a living together in a digitalized world. Or do we let our continent fall apart once more in agony and nationalism, bonding the creativity of open minds, of young people and those who want to share their experiences with the rest of the world? I think we all know the answer, and I find it vital that we meet here today and ask these questions from anew. that we assure ourselves of what we have in common and what is subject to reforming. And I'm sure you share my sentiments that we can speak openly at this occasion and what we make our points clear. This is the key to acting together, and that is why we are here today.
Okay, thank you so much. A lot to think about there. I see that we already have questions coming in from the audience. I will ask just 3 of my own before going to them. The first one, State Secretary, is for you. There was a Financial Times article before the elections, and the headline was, ambivalent Slovaks struggle to, I have the wording here, it was struggle to engage with EU elections. And now that the elections are over, I was hoping that you could comment on this idea that Slovak citizens were ambivalent about the EU elections.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, one fact is true that in the last election, Slovakia set up the negative record in the participations in the EU, in the elections to the European Parliament. This year, we were much better. I mean, the participation increased by 10% compared to the previous one. And now the whole analysis. And the thing is, well, when we look back at the European parliamentary elections of this weekend, there were several trends and tendencies which were positive. First one, there was overall increase of the participation in general in the European Union, which means that we did some progress in communications to the people that the European Parliament is an important institution that brings the concrete results also to the houses of the citizens and voters. The second is that the elections ended better than we expected as far as the divisions between the pro-European parties, regardless if they are from left or right, and the participation or the results of the populist or extremist, even extremist parties. Then, of course, the election showed the change of the paradigm. I mean, for the first time, we don't have only 2 parties, 2 factions to form the future, but we will need the compromise of maybe 3, maybe even 4 factions to form a stable coalition. Now about the Slovaks. I mean, that some of my colleagues, some of our experts call it the Slovak paradox, that we have relatively high support for the EU membership. I mean, the people in Slovakia, when asked, they see and they feel the benefits very, very much. It is more than 70%. But on the other hand, they don't probably feel so much urgency to go for the elections for the European Parliament because they think it's a little bit too far from them, Strasbourg or Brussels, or they don't fully realize and understand what the European parliamentarians are doing. I wouldn't say it's ambivalence vis-à-vis European Union. I would say that it's ambivalence about a certain situation and analysis. I was very deeply involved. I was not a candidate. I was not running for the European Parliament, but we have established so-called the National Convent, the dialogues with the public. So I traveled around Slovakia, and pretty much I have a sense of the sentiments in the different regions of Slovakia. And there is a huge difference between western or southern Slovakia and then central and northeastern Slovakia in what the people think, what is important for their everyday life. So what were the reasons, for example, that still we've got a better result? We've got even better results in political sense, because out of the 14 members of the European Parliament elected in Slovakia, 12 are strong pro-European. 2 are, unfortunately, strong extremists, which is a certain wake-up call also for us. I mean, how to communicate with the people who are putting their votes for someone who does not have any leverage in the European Parliament and does not have any instrument and the possibility to change the course of the things in the European Parliament. But it's our internal. One of the reasons why Slovaks are, as you said, ambivalent is we live in comfort. 3 generations in peace, in cooperation, in Europe. At least 1 generation in Slovakia with the freedoms of moving, traveling, studying, working, etc. So we think it's for granted. The second, we had the presidential elections that were 2 months before the parliamentary elections, and people were a little bit tired because that was the juicy election. But even that election, from the point of view of the support for the European Union, proved that 70% of Slovaks were voting for the second round, the pro-European candidates. The third thing what I would say is that what we need. The campaign was not very attractive, frankly. And if you don't have the story in a campaign, then of course people don't come to vote. They need to see the strong candidates. They need to see the personalities. And I'm sorry for my nostalgia for Poland. I checked, for example, the list of the Polish elected members of the European Parliament. You can find there former prime ministers, ministers of foreign affairs, both sides, European coalitions and the peace, the law and justice. So what I'm saying that probably good thing again in the Slovak elections was that we elected, or the people elected, probably the new generation of the young politicians. In 4 or 5 years, those may be the leaders. Then maybe the last observations in why it was so low, and we were afraid, of course, that who has the story are the populist extremists. And they were coming door to door. And of course they were offering, I say that both are very dangerous, the populists and the extremists. The populists are promising you heaven without having a garden. Extremists are promising you heaven but taking you through the hell. And this is what we have to communicate to people to increase the participation of those 70% of voters who are pro-Europeans, but the portion of them voting was lower than the portion of those 25% who are inclining to vote for the populists. So it's not general ambivalence, but it's the combination of the different factors.
Okay. Speaking of leadership in the EU, which you sort of were, but I will use to transition to my next question for you, Minister. There's this paradox that some describe about the leaders in the European Union, because on the one hand, if there are no Central or Eastern politicians in the top jobs at the EU, then some, for example, the person Politico pointed to was, in writing about this, was Mr. Orban, can say, well, look, there's this bias within the EU, they're prejudiced against us, and then, on the other hand, back in the EU, people can say, well, why would we have these EU skeptics trashing us back in their home countries in the top jobs? And there's this vicious cycle. So how can the European Union break that cycle in the coming term?
I'm not convinced that there is a cycle, because if you look at the current situation, you have, for example, Donald Tusk as the president of the council, coming from the region. But I think that it is also about what Florian Herman mentioned, that there needs to be more openness for debate from different positions. Probably less mentoring, more open discussion. That is something which creates a mental map in Europe that might make the divisions more visible than they really are. And at the end, I think, as we are discussing Central Europe, but in the whole European context, I think that probably we have focused too much on what are the differences, rather than there is much more that connects us, that we have in common, that we share a lot of similar interests. We discussed yesterday in Bratislava with our colleagues from Western Balkans. At the end of the day, with Western Balkan countries, we also share much more than that might divide us. That distinct Western Balkans from the Central Europe or Western Europe. We share same concerns, we share similar values, but we face also same challenges. And that's also which, in context about the debate about Central Europe, I think that this diversity, I think that is there, this reality in Europe, shouldn't prevent us from defining common ground for all of us, for all Europeans. I fully agree that with the panelists that there is a feeling of being European among us. I have the chance to discuss during the campaign with young people about how they feel. And it's not about feeling only European or feeling only Czech or German. I think that at the end we can have many affiliations, many identities that also can help us to overcome some of these difficult issues, as you mentioned, representation in the EU. What are practical expectations? I think that there is an expectation among countries in the region that one of the high-level posts in the European Union should be represented by a person from our part of Europe, that it is a kind of like well-balanced approach, that also the representation express our interest in contributing to European agenda. So we are at the beginning of the debate. I expect that, and we discussed that the atmosphere right now after the elections is relatively optimistic, and I hope that the atmosphere will remain with us throughout the process of, for example, the nomination of the new Commission, appointment of top posts in the European Union. If I may just add probably one thing about Central Europe, because I think that we don't need a definition what Central Europe is, because I think it's enough that we live Central Europe, and I have my personal affiliation because I like cycling, and I spend a lot of time cycling in countries of Central Europe, and I see that I feel very well in this region, because we are a region of strudel, we are a region of schnitzel, we are probably distinct from Italy, France, because we are a region where we have good beer and wine culture, and this is something that you feel that you are at home. So I don't understand necessarily Central Europe politically. It's more also about mental, emotional, well-being. That you really feel well because you feel at home.
Okay. Well, I will
would
take
like
us.
to come back to the point
Please.
from Thomas. To my mind, it's not only the question of representation. You mentioned Donald Tusk. You have, each country has its own commissioner. I think the problem is deeper. We have other experiences in Middle and East Europe. And we have experiences with 30 years with a market system. We made our own experience, and they're different from the experience in Western Europe. And how can we transport these experiences, and how are these experiences represented in Brussels, in Europe? And I think that's the crucial question. And there's a lot of misunderstanding and skepticism. I see it also in my country, in Saxony. It's different, yeah? Eastern Germany, West Germany, growing together. Everything is on the business way, not too bad. A lot of things turned out very well in the last years. The unemployment rate is very low now. But nevertheless, we have a lot of skeptical. And I think it's our responsibility, especially in Saxony, but also a little bit in Bavaria, to work as an interpreter for the countries of Middle and East Europe, and to build bridges between West and Eastern Europe. And that's the point I see for my country, for Saxony, that we always bring the atmosphere and the attitudes from Central Europe also to the capitals in Western Europe, for example. Of course, to Berlin, but also to Brussels. And I think when we work together in our region, then we can transport these experience much better. And that's why we are so ambitious to improve our working together here in our regions.
Going off of that, and I'll give the last question to you, Minister, the big takeaway for some for these elections was that the center has not held, the political center, right? And you see the loss of of mainstream political parties and the rise of the far right and the far left. And I think there's this idea that that's coming from a few countries, right? People talk about Hungary, they talk about Poland. But if you look at the map, Salvini did really well in Italy. Le Pen performed well in France. In Germany, you had the Green Party and people saying, well, where are the Social Democrats? So do you think that well, one, do you see a collapse of the political center? And then if you do you think that that is a regional issue or a European issue?
Very good and interesting question.
Thank you.
It's very different in now.
And it's, I would say, number one, our party received 40.7% in this election, CSU in Bavaria. So no, there is no collapse of our party. But of course, we have very different developments in the different states, and I think there is no one answer to it because it's, I would say, very regional, and the reasons are very diverse. It depends on the history of the respective party, of decisions they made, of mistakes they made. You see, for example, in Austria that the Conservative Party, ÖVP, managed the turnaround, are growing again. So I'm not a friend of burying parties because it's always a question of regional, individual mistakes or not. But of course, it's true that we have sort of a race of extremist parties, left and right, and that is also very different in different countries, especially because the definition what is extremist right and so on differs also because of different history and everything. So I would come to the conclusion: no, there is no collapse of centrist parties, but I would say, but that's also very Bavarian or very German interpretation. We experienced a change in the political system of coordinates. So it's I would analyze that we have sort of a left movement or a shift to the left in general. So the whole party system moved, sort of shifted to the left, which opened space for the right-wing parties, because it was always the doctrine of our party since Franz Josef Strauss not to allow any democratic right-wing party right of our party. And as you can see, we have the AfD even in Bavaria, so it changed, and the reason is that we had the shift of the whole political system to the left, and maybe in other countries it's different.
Thank you. Okay, before I go to Slido, however you say it, are there any questions from just people in the audience? There are microphones around. You have a question, raise your hand. No? Okay. I will go to the app. As an American, I'll make it about me and choose the question that says, what could be the role of Central Europe in shaping the future of the EU-US partnership? Minister, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that there is a positive role for Central Europe in building the future of the relations between the EU and US. I don't like these divides about Atlantists or Europe-oriented countries. I think that it is artificial division also. I think that in general, I think that countries of Central Europe have probably bigger appreciation, and I mentioned in the introduction that for example, Czech Republic, Slovakia, others, probably have the stronger feeling about what the role of NATO is in our security architecture, that we have a lot of common histories with the United States, but also Canada. So, in my understanding, I think we can provide some good examples of where we can cooperate in a positive way with the United States. I think that we should be countries that remember that our relations between the European Union and the United States are not about how profitable transactions are, but also that we share a lot of common values compared to other partners in the world. We are societies that live in democratic, free world with huge respect for individual liberties and human rights. That is something which connects us. So, once more, as we need to work harder as a Central Europe to closing the gaps in Europe, we also need to be active in closing the gaps between the both sides of the Atlantic now. And from our point of view, there is a strong interest in doing so.
Okay. I'd also like to hear from you, Minister Schenk, on this question. What role Central Europe can play in the future of the EU-US partnership?
I think we have to strengthen our common interests and to contribute to a strong Europe, so that a strong Europe can conquer with the US and can bring its position in the not very easy debate. And that's why I think so that cooperation between our countries is so important, that we put it on the agenda, that we have different views in Central Europe, maybe than in Western Europe, and that we bring it together and form a strong Europe to be a part in this globalized world, and that we can play our role as Europe in a globalized world with more than 7 billion people. So if we all together in Europe, we are 500 million. So if we want to have a chance to put our topics on the agenda, then we have to stand together. And that's, I think, our duty here in Central Europe, to do these things that we can do it all together.
It's not on the screen now, but I saw one question for the State Secretary that was, you talk about not wanting artificial divisions, but with the stance that the V4 took on migration, did it create a division within Europe? And I'd like to give you a chance to respond.
Oh, thank you. I adore this question. Just let me put the context. I've spent 6 years in New York, out of which 2 years we were negotiating the migration compact. So I was totally in the core of the whole discussion of the intergovernmental negotiations of 193 countries which were looking for the compromise solutions and for the compromise formulas. And of course, during when the compact was adopted by the member states, I was the head of chef de cabinet of the president of the General Assembly, which really brought me quite a good insight. What's going on. And now, having said that, there are several things. The first, the migration is there. Whatever we do, the migration was there all the time. Thanks to migrations, we are here. If the people were not migrating, we still may be somewhere else, but not in Europe. People are migrating from Slovakia, from Czech Republic. We're migrating between two wars, we're migrating after wars. So this is the natural phenomenon that what the people are doing. The whole idea of the migration was, of course, to create the mechanisms that will fight the things that are not good about the migration, which is the illegal migrations, which is the organized crime and the trafficking in persons, which is really something that can be also seen by some member states as a security risk. Now the division, why the reaction was. I was in New York when I for the first time read about these proposals for the obligatory quota. And I think that this is one of the totally not systemic solution. Again, putting into perspective, the migration counts the hundreds of millions of people around the globe. And we were talking about thousands, 160,000 of people in a quota, what we are talking about, what kind of signal we are sending. So the thing is, the obligatory quota is not a solution. The solution is what we are doing now for the European Union. And this is what Slovakia and the Visegrad 4 are supporting. So it was not a division, it was simply that we were saying our point of view, how it should be handled. And today, where we are? Today we are improving the Schengen borders and the protection of the Schengen borders. This is the key for the citizens of the European Union to feel secure within the European Union. The second, we have to protect Schengen, because if we are talking about the skepticism about that the people are getting far from understanding what the European cooperation is the Schengen is one of the biggest advantages what we created for the people, to show them back 15 years, 89, maybe 30 years, President Havel was mentioned here. The whole idea of unification of Europe was tear down the wall, tear down the borders, tear down the barbarians. So that's the second point. The third point is now we are cooperating with Germany, preparing the project to cooperate with the countries of transit of the migrants and the countries of the origins of the because we have to address the migration where it is. We are cooperating with Italy. Slovakia, without making the much ado, for example, our facility where we can accommodate around 2,500 people from different countries coming to the European Union, we are using it. We had the bilateral agreement with Austria to use this facility to accommodate when these people were waiting for asylum. So, and by the way, these 2,500 is twice as much as was our obligatory quota. So the thing was not non-systemic solutions, but the systemic solutions which will enable the legal migrants to come, because we need the working force. Slovak government also adopted the strategy to get the foreign workers for many of the professions which we are now lacking, having the unemployment under 5%. So the thing is, it was not about it was interpreted as a division and simplified in the Visegrad 4 that the Visegrad 4 are someone who are the bad boys for migrations. But on the contrary, what was there, and it was mentioned several times, EU is the project about the communication. At that time, it was not about communication. It was about telling but not listening. And now we are in a very constructive mood in solving them. So I don't see there any division at this moment, and I think that we are on the same wavelength in these 5 points what I've mentioned. Protection of borders, Schengen, cooperation with the countries of transition, assistance, the Juncker plan for Africa, of the countries of origin, and of course fighting the illegal and all kinds of the organized crime regarding the migration. Full stop. That's where we are.
Okay, you full stopped it.
That's the agenda for whole Europe.
Pardon?
No, so that's the agenda for whole Europe, not only for Central, no?
Excuse me?
It's the agenda for whole Europe.
Yes.
Whole Europe. A question from the audience? No? All right, back to the app. How might the V4 shape the European policy in crucial areas such as defense policy and neighborhood policy going forward? Okay. So let's do the V4. Minister, I'll ask you, and then Minister Herman, if you could speak to how Germany plans to address these issues. So Minister, how might the Visegrad Group help shape European policy in areas such as defense policy and neighborhood policy going forward?
I'm convinced that in both areas, V4, but it is not limited to V4. I think that this is something where we all in this region need to cooperate very closely. But V4 is constructive and positive actor in defense policy, contributing to new initiatives, supporting strongly new initiatives at the European level, participating in our European missions outside, where we want to project stability. And the same applies to neighborhood policy. We have recently celebrated 10th anniversary of the Eastern Partnership, and it was strongly supported by all V4 countries. I have to probably remember some that it was in Prague. The first summit of Eastern Partnership was held in 2009. So, in my understanding, this is actually priorities that are on our agenda in V4. It is part of our positive agenda for European integration, because I think that all V4 countries are convinced that we need stronger security dimension of the European Union. We need to take part of, or need to take more responsibility for our own security when it comes to defense, but also to stabilization in our neighborhood, advocating for more funds going from the European level to this new instrument on external action. So I think that actually this is some of the already existing part of our positive agenda that we agree within V4 we would like to promote within the European Union.
What are the crucial areas? Why is it only defense policy? I think essential for Europe is not only a good defense policy or neighborhood policy, why we are not talking on, for example, cooperation in research, in terms of competitiveness. And I think there is a lot of possibilities for more cooperation in the future. And when I look at the Horizon program, the program of the European Community for helping researchers, there's a lot of place where we can set up new cooperations between our countries, where we can cross-border develop projects in artificial intelligence, in digitalization, we have both, or all countries sitting here on the table, we have strong car manufacturing industries, where will be the next steps, where are the new chances for autonomous driving. I think these are the fields where we should cooperate and where we can make Europe strong.
As a last question, I know you were just responding to the question on the screen, but it's an excellent point that we should expand kind of how we think of cooperation. As a last question, there's one on the screen that says, Mr. Hamann, what is your plan for the European Union?
Great.
I won't have you give your plan for the European Union, but I will ask if you have any, you get the last word, any closing thoughts about the challenges for Central Europe or the European Union more generally going forward.
Well, so which is the question? Oh, I understand. I understood. I would say to the last topic we discussed that I would agree very much with Oliver. I agree with any working closer together like the V4 if it's in a pro-European sense. If the aim is to forward the European cooperation in general and not to slow down the development or fight against the integration and things like that. And that's why I think it's also important to focus on the future challenges, on the main issues, on research, on how we stay together, how we find solutions for the major challenges, climate change, digitalization, artificial intelligence, and all those issues which we have, which makes the European idea and the European integration so important, because we only can solve the issues as Europeans if we do it together. And so we should focus on those important issues, and of course defense is an aspect, and border control is and how to deal with migration are all those very important issues, and we should do it together and fight everything that starts splitting up the very close cooperation within Europe, because that is the business of those outside of Europe who are very critical towards a strong Europe, and that is the enemy of our integration. And so my vision of Europe and it's a very broad question, but I would say that we should do everything that forwards the intelligent integration within Europe, but always guided by respect towards each of us, and not with this moralistic unilateralism that we experience in Western European countries.
Okay, I think that is a great note to end on, and it's the one on which we need to end because we are out of time. Thank you guys for staying a bit later. We started later, so I appreciate your patience. Quick note, the press conference will not be held right after this. It will be at 4:30. We will now take we will now take a brief coffee break before breaking up into the next session of 2 chats. And finally, if you would please join me in thanking our panelists today for a spirited discussion on Central Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good.